This morning I'm going to take you through kind of a 15-minute roundup of where we are. And I'm going to do the 360 or 36,000 point of view. First of all, we're going to look at the UK, and we're going to look at regional UK, and then of course we're going to look at London. So we'll look at the UK, we'll look at essentially everything including London. We'll look at regional UK, which is everything outside of London. And then we'll look more at London, how we're performing here, where we are today, and especially at the boutique element. And then we'll look a little bit at April's data, and it'll become more apparent why I've chosen April as we go through it. And then I'll summarise a little bit into the future, the pipeline that we see coming into the market, where we see the forecast for 2012, and also for year-end 2011. So starting with the UK. So the UK in general is what I call a subdued roller coaster. So we've had some ups, we've had some downs, but we haven't really had huge ups or huge downs either. So kind of post 2001, so we had 9/11, we had then 2003 Iraq War, SARS, a number of people have mentioned that this morning already. We then of course had 7/7. So post kind of the 9/11, this is rolling data. What you're looking at on the left-hand side of your screen pertains to the red trend line, which is your RevPAR, and the right-hand side of the screen is the percentage change for the green and yellow blocks, which is your occupancy and your average rate change. So what you're seeing are the peaks and dips that we had along the way. I think the good news for the UK is that this time round we didn't actually fall as far as we did. So this recession, we didn't fall as far as we did in post-2001, 2002 and entering into 2003. So we had RevPAR of about £49 during that period, whereas this time round the lowest point that we went to was £55. So already we didn't have that £6 margin to make up. As you'll see in the last kind of rolling 12 to 18 months, we've started seeing occupancy pick back up, and we've also seen that those nice little towers of average rates start to pick back up. And I think you'll see as we go through the presentation that's predominantly attributed to London performance. So not a whole lot going on in regional UK, at least at the moment in terms of average rate. So let's move on to that. Regional UK tends to be a much flatter market. So you never see anything more than kind of between kind of 2 and 5%, and at some stages quite flat, very, very muted growth in regional UK. And that's just the nature of the beast. It's a regional market. You don't have the kind of business travel that you have coming into London. You don't have the kind of leisure travel that you have coming into London. So it's a much flatter market. In saying that, though, we're still seeing the occupancy growth across regional UK, albeit those smaller towers of occupancy when you compare it to all UK. And for those eagle-eyed viewers of in the audience, you'll see that we've just started seeing the last rolling 2 months of average rate growth as well. So those tiny little primrose-capped towers over March and April's data of average rate growth. Now in saying that, you'll see that regional UK fell quite far. We were petering on the edge of negative 10%. So there is much more ground to make up in regional UK than there is in a market such as London, which we'll see in a moment. So what's driving the UK? Well, I think it's fair to say across most of the markets that I've chosen here, we're seeing occupancy growth. If we take London out of the equation, we're seeing occupancy growth across about 75%, 77% actually of the markets in the UK that I've chosen here. We're also seeing average rate growth, but it is much more muted to the average rate growth. Now, some of the economists that presented our conference in the US would say that once you've seen 6 months of consecutive occupancy growth, average rate will follow. And I think we're getting very quickly to that point in a number of the UK regional markets where we've seen 6 months of occupancy growth, albeit 1, 2, 3, heading towards the 5, 6%, a little bit more in some of the markets. So certainly we're seeing some of that average rate growth follow. Does that mean we're out of the woods and back to black? Well, actually not quite. What we have on here is we've taken the last 5 years plus the year to date for 2011. We've looked at what the peak month for performance for RevPAR was in any one of these key cities. Let's take London out of the equation for the moment. I think you find it's a pretty scary picture in a certain number of markets. Belfast being the one that stands out most to me. I always say that there's 3 things that have brought Belfast basically to their knees at negative 50, in excess of negative 50%. And there's 3 words that I always use: supply, supply, supply. 3,000 rooms opening in a very, very small market in the space of kind of 6 months. This is what you're going to have. So negative 59%. Dublin's at negative 51.9, so almost 52%. Again, some supply issues in Dublin. Of course, you have to mention massive £1 billion bailout that Dublin had, or at least Ireland had as well. So I think you can see the tough economic times and how they affect different markets. Outside of London, the market that's almost back to where it was in December 2009 is York. So only 2% more RevPAR to make back up, to be back to their peak, which was in December of 2009. Some other markets to point out that aren't that far away from their peak. Portsmouth is only 9.3% away, and Glasgow and Edinburgh, both the Scottish markets, doing exceptionally well in RevPAR terms. Large amount of leisure business going in there, especially with the various golfing tournaments taking place in Scotland, and also quite a significant amount of corporate business going into the Scottish markets, which is certainly helping them to book their trend to get back to where they were in the last 5 years at their peak. So we're not doing so well in the regions. But London is a completely different beast. London has pretty much said, what recession? Don't know what you people are talking about, haven't got a notion, we're all doing fine. We're going to sit back, put our feet up and watch the money roll in. Not quite, I'm exaggerating somewhat. But London, as you can see, has had an upward trend pretty much for the last 10 years with a couple of blips along the way. Over the 13 years of data that we have for London, July had seen the highest RevPAR in 13 years, and that's just continued. It then became August, it then became October, it then became November, and right now in London we have the highest RevPAR we've ever seen. For April 2011 is the highest RevPAR, sitting at £105 for the whole of the London market. It's the highest RevPAR that we've seen in April 2011, in what's supposedly kind of the comeback out of what's been a recession for the majority of the world. Has London seen recession? Of course it has, but nothing to the levels that any other city really in the world has seen when you compare some of the stats that we're seeing for London. So let's drill down a little bit more. Let's look at luxury London. I'm going to show you the boutique hotels now. And I spoke with some of Tim from HVS's colleagues, and we kind of defined what we called boutique hotels in London. So you've taken 35 boutique hotels in London. So how did they stack up? Amazingly well. So you have hotels in here, I know there's people from Ferndale, you have hotels like Threadneedles, you have hotels like the Indigo. And think of the boutique hotels that all of you here today represent. Most of you are going to be included in this slide here. So boutique hotels are sitting at just petering on the edge, £179 and some odd pence, almost £180 average rate for the year to April on a rolling 12 basis. So a really, really strong position to be in London. Especially when you look at what the dip was during the recession, it was almost 10%, just petering on the edge of 10%, about 9.7%. And we're already seeing that occupancy has started coming back, and pretty much immediately average rate followed. And there are those really healthy blocks of average rate growth, not those little buttercups that we've seen for all of the UK in the first slide. So does that mean we're all doing a fantastic job in London, that we can sit back, just wait for these big events to come in? We'll talk about the Olympics in a moment, and kind of name our price and hope the business is going to come in? Well, yes and no. So I said I was going to look at April. And what we're looking at here is I've taken London. So all London is the orange trend line that you're seeing. This is occupancy percent change, just year on year. It's not seasonally adjusted. The green trend line that you're seeing is for the boutique hotels, so the 35 odd hotels I mentioned a moment ago. And then the blue line is the occupancy for the luxury segment. So the first 2 weeks of the month we did phenomenally well. Weekdays we were trading in the 80s, so 80, 82, 85, 87 some nights, pretty much across the city. Came into the third week and we dipped a little bit. Came to the royal wedding and we all thought we were going to sit back and just watch those guests come through the door, and we fell flat on our faces. The night of the royal wedding we had average occupancy of 65% across London. And I think you'll see in all segments here, so for the boutique, for the luxury and for London all, we all pretty much dropped by almost 40% in occupancy year on year. So we had 40% less guests filling our rooms. Why was that? Part of the reason was because we priced ourselves out of the market. So we raised our rates so high that only the different heads of state that came in, which is why the luxury segment did very well on average rate, and you've seen into the 20s, and we'll see that in a moment, so in excess of 20% average rate growth. but at the expense of a huge portion of occupancy, which meant that your RevPAR actually ended up being in negative territory. So what did that look like for all the different segments across London? Not a pretty picture when you look at the left side of the screen, where you see your occupancy decline. Okay picture if you're sitting in the right segment in the middle, and then not a pretty picture again on the right hand side when we look at the RevPAR. So across London in its entirety, so the whole market, we gained 7.5%, boutique hotels gained 7.3% on average rate, luxury 22.9%, and then as we peter down through the different grades, you'll see all of us actually lost on RevPAR. So essentially we priced ourselves out of the market. Had we kept our rates at a more affordable rate, we may have actually been able to recoup some of that occupancy and ended up with a positive figure on RevPAR. I think what you need to take away from this slide is don't let this happen for the Olympics. And to summarise just some things about the Olympics, we're in a very different position for the Olympics, at least in my opinion, than a lot of the other Olympic cities have been. The Atlantas, the Beijings, the Athens. We have two, I'm broadly speaking calling pre-Ramadan an event, but we have two different segments of customers that we can basically capitalise on prior to the Olympics. So Ramadan will start when the Olympics starts, which is great because we have our Middle Eastern customers coming in prior to that time. We also have Farnborough next year, and then we have the Olympics. So we're in a slightly different position to the Athens and the Beijing and the other Olympic cities. A word of caution though, you'll see the bottom half of the screen gives you figures for what the Oxford Economics are predicting in terms of tourist arrivals into the city for the Olympics. But let's look at what was predicted, not by Oxford Economics, might I add, but in other cities, and let's look at what they actually achieved. So a word of caution that that 380,000 may not materialise if we're going to trend in the same kind of way as we did for other Olympic cities did. We also need to look at some of the pipeline. So this is pipeline hotels that haven't actually opened yet. Included in the luxury scale, and here for a moment, this particular slide is the new Ferndale Hotel with the new Intercontinental Westminster included in here, the Shangri-La and the Fourth Wing of Aidsmead off the top of my head. We have new Hiltons in here in the upper upscale. We also have some Holiday Inns, and of course in the budget sector we have a number of Premier Inns, a number of Travelodge properties and an Easy Hotel also in there. Any of the segment here that is unnamed or undecided is basically not decided on the brand yet, or they haven't decided on physically where the hotel is going to sit in the city, but they are going to build a hotel. But anything that's in kind of the orange, green, anything other than pink is in the pipeline, is going to open, and a lot of it's going to open in the next kind of 6 to 24 months. So what are we looking at in terms of forecast? Where do we see London finishing 2011 and where do we see London finishing 2012? Our forecast model currently tells us that London will finish RevPAR up 3.5%, and that for 2012 we will have good RevPAR growth, but probably not what a lot of you in this audience are expecting. This is of course across all of London. It's not just a luxury segment and it's not just boutique hotels, but a pretty strong 5.5% as per our June results that we just put out a couple of days ago. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening.